Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be bringing you the farming programme back here on Manx Radio. This programme was recorded last Tuesday night as we sat on Douglas Head on one of the most glorious September evenings that I think I ever remember. In fact, the whole of September really has been a very, very wonderful month. And that makes a change because we've come through a rather difficult summer. In fact, it's quite a long time since we spoke on the farming programme, and a lot has happened since then. And a fine lot hasn't happened as well. But it has been quite a difficult summer, with the weather very, very difficult during haymaking and silage making. I don't think I ever remember silage making starting so late as it did this year, as we all waited and waited for better weather. And some of us have got bales of hay made. I'm not sure what we're going to do with them, really. They're certainly not of feeding quality, and some of them may only be used for bedding. But then the weather gradually improved as we came into harvest, and the start of the harvest got off to a good start. In fact, it's gone quite well. And I think by now, most of the harvest in the island is just about gathered. I think there's one or two fields that might just be still in the later areas, perhaps, or perhaps somebody's been unfortunate enough to have a breakdown. But the weather is still holding for them, and barley, although it's very, very ripe now, is actually taking no harm in this very, very good weather. Now, harvests have come and gone as each year turns, and we've seen tremendous changes. And a man who has been associated with the harvest, in fact, his name is almost synonymous with the Manx harvest now, is Ken Callister. Ken Callister of Collett Sons and Cowleys, who have been involved in the Manx harvest. And I asked Ken to come and talk to me about this year's harvest and about harvests that he remembers in days gone by. Ken, it's been a good harvest spell. Am I right? Has most of the harvest been gathered?
Yes, I think a number of the farms have got their melia now, John. They've got it all safely gathered in. I think the yields have been very variable because of the year. We had that cold spell late spring, early summer when we should have been getting summer. And some of the crops got stunted a bit then because besides the weather conditions, there was also the lack of lime this year, which affected some barley crops. But in the north of the island, they've certainly had a lot of nice, good spring grain. And so on the south as well. I think it's the centre of the island that was most affected.
But Ken, the island is only 30 miles long and 12 miles wide. Do you really get this difference?
We do. We get the weather differences very greatly spread over the island, as you know. And in the sunny north of the island, they get a better proportion of nice weather to do the harvest in, I think, than in the centre part.
I think probably it's a little bit earlier on the sandier ground as well, isn't it? The
yes,
harvest.
it is.
It tends to, it's in earlier and it ripens earlier,
yes.
and they're harvesting in what's usually good weather anyway.
Yes, Mackle is usually the latest part of the north, and when you get up Cronkelbody Way and the Braid Way all done, you're getting toward the end of harvest then.
Well, it's great interesting, isn't it? Some people will know that I take Harvest Festival services, and if you look at the timing of Harvest Festival service, Harvest Homes in the countryside, that reflects exactly what you've said. You'll be invited maybe to go to preach at Sandygate or somewhere in the last days of September. But when you come to Kerrakeel or Agnish, we're almost in November before. And that was a legacy from the days when Harvest Home was very meaningful to country people. And I suppose you've known, Ken, people who would not go to a harvest home if the harvest wasn't all gathered.
Oh yes, the old people, unless the harvest was all finished, they didn't like going to harvest home. I remember when I first left school, we were out at Mr. Cayley's out in Santon. There was 4 farms there, Seafield, Glentroe, Ballafurt and Arganveg. And in the year 1947, when we had the snow from the beginning of January out until the beginning of March, it meant that the ploughing was very late getting done, and we had 104 acres of corn. And rigged up Heath Robinson type lights on the old grey Fergie, and the Fordsons were going for all their worth too. And it was October time before it was all finally finished. And I can clearly remember my father saying, well, we can't go to any harvest home until we've got all this finished.
Aye. It had a lot more meaning for the old people, didn't it?
Oh, it had a great meaning. The harvest was really the occasion of the year, culmination of the year's work, if you like, wasn't it? Yes.
Do you think we've lost something, Ken? Because now we have we can store grain from one year to the next, and we never seem to be desperately short. But in those days, if you had a bad harvest, you had no fodder for the stock.
Yes, I think in those days there was a great neighbourliness, and if people were a bit short, they tended to help each other a lot. And of course, they had their mill days when they were get 20 to 23 people around the table, and they'd be talking about how good or how bad the harvests were, and they had a good idea of what each farm had, and they used to all help each other to a great extent.
Yes.
Yeah.
But harvests then were much more demanding. I can remember, I'm sure you can remember as well. Do you remember cutting roads, Ken?
Oh yes, cutting roads with a scythe and making bands.
We better tell our non-farming listeners perhaps what that actually means.
Well, cutting roads with a scythe was actually opening up the field by doing one cut right round the field with a scythe to enable the binder to get in, so that the binder didn't jam when you started cutting corn properly with the binder machine. And it was done with a scythe, and a couple of people following up making bands and making sheaves. And then, of course, eventually when the field was all cut by the binder, you had to go and stook it. Then if the weather was bad, you'd be shifting stooks and that sort of thing.
Before we got to that, Ken, let's go back a bit to cutting roads, because I can remember cutting roads. Well, I wasn't cutting. Uncle Stephen would be the scythesman. He would be the man with the scythe. With used to be a striggle tied on the handle of the scythe for sharpening, like a small cricket bat with sort of an oiled piece of wood. And they used to rub sand in it and sharpen the scythe.
Yes, my father used to be a great fella for wanting edge. You had to have the edge on the scythe to do it. I suppose I'd have forgotten how to use the scythe by now, but I can remember those days well.
And then they became modern, didn't they? The sharpening stone, then a carborundum stone, which invariably they carried in their back pocket of their overall and took edge every now and again.
Yes, I remember them carrying that in the back pocket of the dungarees. Yes,
and us kids would have to lift the corn and make bands, and make sheaves.
Yeah.
And I can remember if the corn was lying a certain way, it had to be lying off the scythe, off the man who was cutting.
Yes.
And if that was a certain way, he would cut it into the hedge.
Yes.
Which invariably put it in amongst the briars and the gorse, and you were picking thorns out of your fingers for days.
Yes, it didn't
afterwards.
make it easier to pick up, did it? Nor did the thistles near the hedge.
But they were thrifty and careful people in those days.
Oh, they were very thrifty, careful people. I've heard my father say that when he was a young boy, that they used to actually dig the corners out in the fields of St Mark's, to the square corners, to get the maximum use of the soil in the field, which of course in this modern day and age wouldn't even be thought about.
That's right. You said, Ken, that the roads were cut to open up the field so it didn't jam in the binder, but it was also done so that the horses or the tractor or the binder didn't actually trample it with wheel marks.
Yes, that was it. But the other thing what I was meaning was that if you didn't cut roads, and some fellas tried to do without it, the corn would all get jammed round the big wheel, and the horses would be pulling and going nowhere because the whole binder would be jammed.
Yeah. It was quite an occasion, quite a season, wasn't it, when it started? I can remember cutting roads and finding the first blackberries. That was always to be the time when you were cutting roads. You'd find the very first blackberries of the season.
And weren't they lovely when you came across the first ones when you're out doing beautiful. A job like that? Yes.
But we cut acres and acres with the binder, didn't we? And
yes.
And it really was a very wonderful machine, really.
It really was. I can remember about 1950-51 time, out at Mr. Odson's at Ballamore and Patrick, which was later found by Mr. Ian Anderson, and still in the Anderson family, of course, that we managed to get the loan of an Albion 5A binder, which was a power-driven binder, to do the lower fields because they were very wet fields. And what a help that was in comparison to the old big wheel drive, getting stuck in the mud and whatever. Like it was like a new experience for us, and we thought it was wonderful.
It's rather strange, Ken, when you look back and think of the massive crops of oats we used to grow with very little fertiliser in those days.
Oh yes, a couple of bags of superphosphate was all they'd put under, and if a field was quite a rich field, it probably wouldn't even do that. And yet the crops of oats and the varieties of oats that were going in those days were marvellous and stood the test of time. Things like Onward and Forward and Victory and and Marvellous and Abundance.
Marvellous was actually a breed of variety of oats. Yes,
it was a variety. Yeah.
But what reminded me of that was often enough a heavy crop of corn in a lay field would go down.
Yes.
And it'd be almost flat, and you'd have to cut it with the binder, and cutting that one way.
Yes,
it's only one way.
Well,
the
one
binder
way
would cut
that was a slow job.
It was indeed, and pulling tangled sheaves out of the forks, so they didn't get wrapped round twice.
Yeah, so they didn't get wrapped round the knotter and break the knotter and all that sort of thing. Yeah,
and then when that was finished, then the job of stooking it, as you rightly say.
Yes.
And a right way and a wrong way of stooking, and
heavens, yes.
had to be done right.
Oh, it had to be done right, otherwise they'd never stand the weather.
And then they were supposed to hear the bells, the church bells, for 3 Sundays, weren't they?
Yes, they reckon. Some of the people used to be quite content with a fortnight, but the older generation used to say they wanted to hear the bells 3 Sundays before they brought it in.
Yes, that was to make sure, because
sometimes they'd stack it on the field if they could get the mill into the field and so on, and other than that it'd have to come over to the hack and be stacked there.
Because in fact it was cut fairly, what we called on the heavy side, before it was entirely ripe, didn't we?
Oh yes,
like to be in early and not too late.
Yes, it because you knew that it would ripen in the stook.
Yes,
in that period of time.
That's right,
and that's what gave them that advantage. Because when combine harvesters came in, people thought you were going to go in as early as that with the combine harvester. And I can remember Mr. Harley Coke, our director called Sons and Cowleys at the time, saying to people, if you think it's ready for the combine, go and have a fortnight's holiday and then come back to it.
Yes. I remember that being said, Ken.
Yes.
But we talked about stooking corn, and stooks were 8 sheaves.
Yes, either 8 or 10 sheaves.
8 or 10 sheaves.
Some done them 8s and some done them 10s.
Yeah,
yes.
and left heads up and standing, and hoping that the pigeons didn't settle on them, and it wasn't too wet.
Yeah,
because
and you had a rail on the stiff cart because that gave you a wider foundation for the load, and you could put more on. With that,
and cart that home to the hacket.
Yes.
And stacks made on beds of gorse that had been cut.
Yes, you had to get the bed and all down first before you started carting in.
Yeah, yes. And then make the stack.
And they always used to believe in plenty of middle in the stack, as they said. So,
and it was the secret, wasn't it?
It was the secret, because if it was caving in or too much and caving out, it wasn't right. The job had to be correct, and they knew how to stack.
Yeah.
They were craftsmen.
Oh yes. And the stacks were very rarely did you see a wet stack.
Very rarely indeed. And then they used to thatch them, and they used to put these. They'd get kayar and go round and round the stack with the kayar ball. Yes. And with a pitchfork and put it around, and then make like a kayar net, and then put the big stones hanging down so that the thatch didn't move with the bad weather.
That's right.
And so on. And it was laborious. A lot of work. A lot of days' work went into it.
But before they even got to that stage, Ken, actually carting corn in, I noticed on my calendar last week, I think it was the 24th, it said it was the harvest moon. Yeah. And many, I suppose you've carted many a load of corn in moonlight.
Oh heavens, yes. Yes, it was a thing that was getting done on a fairly regular basis, if you like, I can always remember my mother telling the story of a gentleman who had a bit of ill health and couldn't get round to getting the corn done, and it was the harvest moon, and they all went after the Braid Chapel into this gentleman's field. You see, he'd cut it, but it wasn't stooked, and they took and stacked it all. And when he got up in the morning, he couldn't understand how this field was stacked. And it'd been all the young people from around the Braid that had stacked it, because they knew he'd be thrashing it in the field.
Yes.
And they thought he'd be most pleased. And the fellow was ever so angry because they'd stacked it in the wrong place. Yes. But he should have really been grateful that they gathered the corn for him and got ready for thrashing.
Yes. But you can remember those harvest nights, can't you, when there was a hard, strong east wind, perhaps, which was very, very dry and very, very good harvest weather.
Yes.
And you would work on all hours, if you thought you could take advantage of the weather.
Yeah.
And it really was, when the last load came in, it was something to be enjoyed.
Yes, they used to carry the last sheaf on the pitchfork following the last load, didn't they?
Right, yes.
A lot of people in those days. Yeah. So glad to get the mill, yeah.
That's right, and then to go to cut thatch, cutting thatch again with a scythe, Ken, because often it was cut off a meadow which was too wet to carry any machinery.
Oh yes, and the rushes and things. That you did need edge then on the scythe.
Aye.
You needed a good scythe man to do that.
And haven't you stood on the rungs of a ladder with your feet almost cut in two, holding saps of rushes for the thatcher?
Yes, yes, you had to hold
And
it, and you had to hold it the right way and the right height.
Handling thatch.
Oh yes,
it was a great time. But the stacks would stand in the hacket, and then they'd be thrashed, and then that's when your next job really came into play, because oats would be sold to the merchants, wouldn't they?
Yes, they'd be sold to the merchants. All the seconds and everything was taken out in the thrashing of it,
Aye.
so it was good oats, you know. And of course, they were 100 and a half sacks, and Corlett, Sons and Cowley's lorry would arrive, and those chaps were excellent at packing loads and so forth. And they normally put anything 100 to 110 sacks on a load, and it was a lot of grain.
It was amazing.
And
wasn't
it was amazing. There'd be two men on the lorry, and quite often they had a stick with them, and they had the stick between the two of them, and they just laid the sack on the stick and then lift up and onto the deck of the lorry.
Yes. And up again after that onto the top of the load.
Onto the top of the load after that, yes, because they were stacking the load as well. Yes.
Those men must have lifted a tremendous amount of grain, Ken, in their time.
Oh, tremendous. Grain and fertiliser. I mean, we called Sons and Cowleys used to bring 3,000 or 4,000 tonnes of fertiliser in a year, and that was all put over their backs, you know. Fantastic men, and as fit as fiddles. I mean, some of them lived to the 80s, 90s. It amazed me, but they were hardened to their work.
Yeah. Can you remember some of them?
Oh yes, people like old Mr. Joe Corkle. He lived till he was 92, and there were drivers like Harry Killier and John Oates, and in the north there was Bobby Patton and Bobby Kelly, and there was Albert Clegg. Chap I've never mentioned very much was Albert, but he was with us for years and years, and he was so quiet and good, and he was just getting on with it as if it was the everyday thing to happen.
Yes.
He was an excellent fellow. He died 2-3 years ago.
Yeah.
One of these fellows I had to give rejuvenation tablets to. He was that good.
But there's two brothers as well in our area.
Oh yes, yes, the Lowney brothers, Walter and Leo, yes, good strong men too,
really
and did a lot of handling of sacks and everything. Tremendous amount.
Yes. And that all came in then to Colton Cowley's. How did you store it then, Ken?
Well, it was stored in sacks, and it was stacked up, and they'd be out at Union Mills stacking after the day's work was done till late at night, stacking it right up to the roof.
Really?
These sacks, like.
What about?
And again in Ramsey.
Was the grain always dried, Ken? Did you always have a dryer?
Well, my time, the small dryer was there at Union Mills. Yes, Penny and Porter. And then there was a penny porter in Ramsey, and then we got the bigger penny and porter at Union Mills. And those dryers did for years.
Because grain will not store unless it's down to a certain percentage moisture.
It's got to be the percentage of moisture has got to be taken down to keep it. Yes.
Yes. So was that if you didn't have too much drying facilities, could that be a sort of a bottleneck in the whole process?
Oh, it was to a certain extent. That little dryer, we've still got it, and it only did between 1,300 to 2 tons an hour. So you can guess, you know. And I've seen Mr. John Cubban at Union Mills there, and Ernie Karen, and there'd be sacks of grain out on the yard with stack covers over them, waiting to be dried, like, you know. And of course they'd be lifting these stack covers up during the day because they didn't want the grain to sweat, and just putting the stack covers down over them at night, like, and all this sort of thing. They were tremendous fellas because the hours they worked, and it was hard work. It was fantastic, and yet you never heard them grumble. Yeah. It was what happened in those days. There was never a word about stress or
leisure, time to think about
leisure time and different things like that. It was work, like.
But did they work through the night, Ken, on the dryers?
I have known them do that, but on a normal season, no. They would work till about 9 o'clock at night, or something like that. You see,
yes.
8 or 9 o'clock. But after that, they would stack the sacks with the other fellas too. After that, until maybe 11 or
till the job
12,
was done.
You know.
Yes.
And they'd be early start again next morning, like, you know. But they were fantastic fellas, that generation.
But that's all away in the past now, Ken. That's all.
It's all away in the past.
Yes. I suppose some would say good riddance.
Well, some fellas would think awfully hard of going back to it, do all that manual work again.
Indeed.
Now, wouldn't they?
Yes. Well, we wouldn't go back knowing what we know now, would we?
No, I don't think so.
We couldn't go back to it.
No, I don't think so.
But we've come to a very, very different harvest now. What's taking place in the harvest field nowadays, Ken? I mean, the combine moves in.
Yes. A combine can move in and it doesn't take many hours to do the field. And they have bulk trailers there to take the grain away, either into the merchants or to their own buildings or whatever. And if it's harvested in good fettle, they'll sometimes wait a little while till the harvest is finished before starting bringing it into us, And depends on the weather conditions and so forth. And sometimes, of course, it comes in just as it's being harvested,
So you never see a 100 weight and a half sack of grain at all now, Ken?
No, the only sacks of grain we have now is our seed grain, which are now in 50 kilos, which is about 110.5 pound. And that's a lot lighter, thank goodness, than 168.
So if a farmer brings his own grain into either Derby or into Union Mills, say in a grain trailer, he kicks it in the pit.
Yes.
What happens to it then?
And it goes from the pit up over the cleaner and elevator, either to the bins awaiting drying, or over the dryer setup and so forth, and then into the bins.
Yeah. According
to the conditions and whatever the setup is for that particular grain.
And the actual business of the harvest has changed as well, hasn't it? The reason grain was grown, most grain in those days was actually grown to sell to the merchants.
Yes, and the merchants used to ship. Manx oats used to be shipped to Whitehaven for Quaker porridge oats.
Did Manx oats have a special quality then, Ken?
It did. The best oats reckoned to be in the British Isles were Scottish oats and Manx oats. And Quakers were very keen to have the Manx oats because of its bushel weight and because of the quality and so forth. And that went on right up until the time when porridge sort of went out of fashion.
Was that why we lost it? Because
Quakers had to close it down at Whitehaven.
But they tell us now that oats are becoming popular again. I read an article only this week that oats are becoming popular.
Well, some people say that in America it never did go out of fashion. It's still in fashion.
But they say now that it reduces cholesterol and all the rest. And could you see it ever coming back again?
Well, I think it's like lots of things. It has its place, you see. I know that we haven't got a market for oats as such from the Isle of Man. There is one place in Crewe that deals in oats, and I tried hard a few years ago to get in on that with a market for Manx oats, but I wasn't successful. And I think that they are more or less over onto the organic oats now, to a specialised job again, you see.
But you mentioned earlier, Ken, when we were talking about the difficulty in obtaining lime on the Isle of Man in the spring of this year.
Yes.
In fact, oats was much more tolerant to an acid soil than barley or wheat.
Oh, yes. Well, the pH value, which is what you measure the alkalinity or the acidity of the soil with the pH value. Barley will just fail under 5.3 and wheat will fail under 5.1, whereas oats, you see, you can go right down to 4 acidity. But the majority of people's fields in decent heart are between 6 to 7 odd, and even then they put lime on to keep the alkaline level good for the barley and so on.
But when fellows were sowing oats and all and counting up the acreage, they were also counting up how much it would take to pay their bill at the merchant, weren't they? Because that's how business was done in those days.
Yes, they used to come down to the show day once a year and pay the bill off, you see. And
once a year?
Yeah, sometimes they'd come down and say, well, I know that won't quite clear it, but we'll put an extra field in next year and we'll make sure we'll clear it then. Well, that day, of course, has been and gone too.
It really was a very wonderful way of life, though, Ken.
Oh yes, they did a lot of trade by barter, if you like.
There's a lot of trust, wasn't there?
Oh, tremendous trust between everybody. It would be a rare occasion when somebody couldn't be trusted. Aye. And we were always brought up to believe that you made less mistakes by trusting people than by not trusting them. I suppose some people would say we live in a slightly different society than that nowadays, with different thinking.
Yes.
And I mean, there was no such thing as credit cards and goodness knows what all in those days like there is now.
Right. So what of the future then, Ken? Where do we go? We know agriculture generally is in very difficult times at the moment. But we're told, aren't we, in Genesis in the Bible, that as long as the earth remains, seed time and harvest will never fail.
Well, I think that's a true saying, and I used to use that in our adverts for years and years, that seed time and harvest shall not fail. And I do believe that. And I think the old adage still remains true as well. There used to be one in agriculture which said, farm as though you'll farm forever, live as though you'll die tomorrow. And I think that's still true to a certain extent. The fellas who've remained really steady and kept their feet on the ground, not got too carried away with all the different influences of different sorts, you know.
Yeah.
So that they spend lots of money and then that's gone out of fashion 2 or 3 years later and they've got to go into something else and then that's gone out. But the fellow who stayed really steady and solid farming, he's still going. The other thing, I suppose, we were led down the road of specialisation, whereas in the likes of the 30s, when there was no money in anything, they used to reckon to have mixed farming on the Isle of Man, a little bit of everything, so that they kept everything going. And whether this specialisation is now leading us to a different sort of eventual object again is debatable.
One of the developments, of course, in recent years has been the ability to grow milling wheat on the island. And this has been quite a major step forward, hasn't it?
Well, this has been good.
Yeah.
Because before that they were having to bring in Canadian wheat and so on, weren't they?
Yeah.
And even the milling wheat job is now on a sort of a quota basis.
Yes.
I believe it's around about 2,600 tonnes for the island, or whatever lax you can use.
That's right.
Sort of style.
That's right.
Whereas with barley and feed wheat, it's still like a semi-free-for-all, if you like,
Yes.
providing you were in the acreage scheme in 1993. Then your holding is registered to be able to grow grain, and so you can choose between sort of oats for your own feed, or peas and oats, or peas for protein,
But there's
or feed wheat or barley.
Yeah, there's other developments as well, Ken, isn't it? We've talked about cutting with the binder and cutting with combine harvesters. That's changing as well, because stock feed, grain for stock feed, it needs weather. It's still quite laborious and still very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I know we've done some at home this year. We've done some whole crop, which means chopping the crop up before it's
crimping.
Before
Whole
it's
crop and
actually ripe.
Yeah. And that's starting to catch on now too.
It is. So,
change again.
So that is going to change, isn't it? And,
it'll change things again, no doubt,
yes.
over a period of time. Yeah.
And I think the important thing is that we keep up with it
Yes.
and be open-minded and move forward with it.
You have to be open-minded, because you see, when you look back and think that the likes of cattle and sheep and goats and horses and pigs have been known to man, they reckon, on estimate, about 4,500 years, and that barley was found in the pyramids 2,000 years ago and so forth. Man has known how to look after stock, and he has known how to look after crop.
Yes.
And although these different fashions and trends, as I call them, come and go, basically, agriculture is an excellent basic industry, and you have to have food, shelter and clothing, and agriculture is connected in all those three.
So the harvest is still meaningful, Ken.
It's still meaningful.
We'll all go to our harvest homes and we'll sing the harvest hymns with great feeling, because we're part of that scene, Ken, aren't we, that the hymn writers wrote about and the poets wrote about. That's ours. They were writing about us, weren't they?
Well, it's been our lifetime anyway, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has, Ken.
And I've been proud to be associated with it, and I've worked with some wonderful people.
Yeah. So, Ken...
That includes the farming community, as well as Ken Callister and other people I've met. Yes.
Ken, we've come to the end of our time, sadly. It's been very, very interesting talking with you, remembering old times, seeing how things are now, and then looking forward, perhaps, as to how things might develop in the future. But Ken, there's always going to be a harvest, isn't there?
Oh, I think so. Yes, I think so.
On that note, Ken...
Seed time and harvest shall never fail.
Aye, on that note, Ken, thank you very, very much for joining us. And ladies and gentlemen, this is John Kennaugh signing off now until next week's programme.